Well, Joe, it's good to see you, and let's talk a little bit about contemporary Australia's failure in political leadership, as I'd like to put it. I'm not sure how you would put it.
Uh, the bleak picture of Australian politics. Well, let me ask you, Alan, first. What is it about the political landscape which most troubles you?
I think, first of all, it's the structuring of our political parties and the decline of support for political parties for what I think are very good reasons, but the parties themselves don't seem to realise that. That's the first aspect. But then they're looming over all of this are the huge challenges we're facing globally. And of course, climate change is the major one, but also the desperate situation of refugees and asylum seekers around the world. And one third point I'd make finally would be to look at the ravages of economic policies over the last 30 to 40 years, which have created the conditions in which we see political parties in decline, political leadership going off the rails, and the world plunging into some terrible conflicts.
Yes, I very much agree with what you're saying. Perhaps I can add a couple of observations to which you might respond. Yes, it is, of course, the problem, I think, is structural, but it does mean that you get, if I can put it as crudely as this, second-rate personalities flocking to the political parties. And we say second rate because we don't want to be uncharitable. These people, by and large, there are notable exceptions, as we all know. But those who reach senior positions of either of the major parties, and we can discuss this, the smaller ones and the independents, perhaps a little later on. But those two major parties are so structured that they don't attract people with ideas, with wide-ranging knowledge, or with the necessary courage to make difficult decisions, let alone with the interest of communicating and engaging with and liaising with the society at large on the various challenges we face, some of which you have already named. So there is this structural problem. Now, the question I think then to ask is, why is it so? It needn't be so. Did God wave a magic wand and it shall be so? I doubt it. So what I think is the key is that political parties and the machinery of government generally has fallen into the hands of some very powerful interests, which like the situation to be as it is, because it enables them, those powerful interests, to operate more effectively than they would, of course, if you had the political landscape occupied by people who were courageous, who were highly knowledgeable, and who were in tune with the major challenges we face. That would make life very uncomfortable for them. Now, you might then ask, and I'll stop in a moment, you might then ask, what are these powerful interests? Well, I think the powerful interests are the interests that control the commanding heights of the economy. And many of those, of course, are not just Australian corporate interests, but very much international ones. And the second basket of powerful interests is around the security establishment. In its various through its various agencies, many of which, in fact, probably all of which, are very closely connected to their counterparts, especially in the United States, but in a number of other countries. And each of those, they're not monolithic. There are differences within them, but by and large, they generally share the feeling that the system as it currently operates more or less suits them, and they have no interest in changing it. So I think that's where we're at the moment. And that's why I'm not particularly encouraged by what the smaller parties, in particular the Greens, have to offer, or indeed the independents. And I say that not because there aren't some good people there, but because I'm not sure that they fully understand the depth of the problem as I see it, anyhow, and certainly have not given much inkling that this may well is on their minds and they have a strategy for moving forward. Enough from me. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you. I entirely agree with your comments, particularly, first of all, about the elites in charge of the commanding heights of the economy, business leaders, leaders of banks, and so on, and also the intelligence community per se. I'd want to add to that the media and the concentration of media ownership and the aligning of the interests of the ownership with the kinds of people that you've been talking about, that it suits them to misspeak truth, to tell lies, to engage in propaganda on a massive scale that we've not seen in many, many years. The last 30 or 40 years have seen this development, I think. And the fourth one I'd want to point to would be the failure in our education systems. I think schools have been under-resourced, public schools in particular. Private schools have been overly resourced, and this has really seriously exacerbated inequalities in our society, as well as the dumbing down of curricula at the primary school and secondary school levels. I'm aware of teachers who are massively overstressed by the demands being put on them. And so often, instead of being educational institutions, they're really therapeutic institutions and sort of places for incarcerating difficult young people rather than being schools. And then, of course, there are the universities and the rest of the higher education sector, which has been terribly vandalized, particularly in Australia, since, for the last 30, again, 40 years, where very important differences in educational institutions were overridden, and they were all pushed into the one system, and they're all trying to do exactly the same thing.
The neoliberal model.
Exactly. And so we're confronted with these deep, as you put it, deep structural crises, really, in our society. And one final point I'd like to make here is we've also confused the idea of democracy, which I think is a very sacred idea, with the institutions of political parties and representative government. That's not the same thing as democracy. And the political parties have become structures of enabling power elites, not representing people and their interests and their needs and engaging generally. I don't know whether that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And just to perhaps elaborate on that last point, Alan, the decline of the democratic idea, at least as understood and practiced by our political class, is one which minimizes transparency, accountability, and certainly participation, active participation by the wider society. And that again suits those interests, because that's why we have, I think, the emergence of the increasingly secretive state, the state that's not accountable, and the political machinery of government increasingly outsourced, not least to totally unaccountable large consultancy firms, which ironically happens to be the very same firms that university rely on increasingly and at very considerable expense. And at the cost of support for academic staff. I have seen a recent reference to the proportion of monies spent on administrative infrastructure of the university versus the academic staffing of the university, and I think we're getting very close to the administrative infrastructure costing more than the combined salaries of all academic staff. So that tells you something about the drift of universities' thinking and approach to education.
I think that's absolutely the case. And you can also apply that analysis to our secondary and primary schools. First of all, the public sector, government-owned schools, are now run by departments of education whose senior echelons are occupied by the very people we're talking about, who are interested, and indeed, if you look at the resourcing of the department versus monies being spent in schools on students and teachers, again, that kind of worrying trend that you've outlined in universities is very evident in schools. In the private sector of schools, secondary and primary, once again, exactly the same sort of thing. CEOs, headmasters, principals, heads of those schools, and the management levels. I know one private school, for example, no longer describes its principal as a principal, but as a CEO. And it sort of reflects the kind of managerialist, power grasping, and self-rewarding nature of this managerial class. So we've got these very serious problems right at the very heart of our education system.
Which then impinges on civic engagement and much else. Even the very purpose of education has now very much been channeled to the interests of so-called industry.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Rather than education for life and for engagement with the rest of society, it has become, and the interests of industry are in a sense justified or rationalized as providing you with a good job, which often it doesn't do. Even that is not achieved. But nevertheless, that is the overriding justification that is given, and that's really not the primary function of a university.
Indeed. And I'd add to that our failure to not only educate for life, but educate people so they can imagine and create alternatives to the fact. As Max Weber once said, we've become locked in an iron cage of rationality. Well, I call it an iron cage of neoliberal managerialism. It's a very grim imprisonment of the human mind, the human brain, the human capacity to be creative and to be excited by being creative.
Yes. Someone put it, I think, a bubble of irrelevance.
Yes. But bubbles are easily burst. That's the problem. I mean, it's the iron cage, the imprisoning, the locking of young minds in particular into a whole series of slogans and ideologies, which I think are very inimical to humanity's survival.
The fact that quite a number are nevertheless able to break free from this cage is almost a miracle. But happily, fortunately, a number are able to. So that raises the question, where do we see glimmers of hope and what can be done.
As a very interesting political leader once said, what is to be done? Indeed.
Yes. Well, it's an appropriate question for our time.
A very appropriate one, yes. I am increasingly inspired by a younger generation of leadership I think is emerging, and are ready to, this generation is showing glimmerings of hope, of being ready to take on the establishment. Now, of course, as with many young people, some go over the top, some start engaging or dragged off in wrong directions. But I'm inclined to call this generation the Greta Thunberg generation. They've seen, and it's not just the remarkable young lady Greta Thunberg herself, but her generation, who see the horrific consequences of climate change building up. It's their future that they're becoming aware of. But they're also beginning to question the morality or immorality of government decisions. And I think the current protest movements on university campuses here in Australia and in other parts of the world relating to the conflict in Gaza and the Israeli invasion of Gaza is an interesting case in point. Now, I'm not saying I entirely agree with all of those demonstrations, but I'm encouraged to see that young people are asking very important questions.
Yes. While I agree with you, my sense is, of course, things can change, that what you're describing is not so much the younger generation, but a fraction of it, and probably not a very large fraction. Now, yes, there are, to follow up on the example you've given, yes, there are these protests currently taking place in a number of university campuses, but it's a very small fraction of the total number of students enrolled at any of those universities. Now, admittedly, some may not be willing to occupy certain buildings the way some have been willing to do, and that itself, therefore, is not a very good indicator. But even if you were to ask the question, let's say, of a representative group of Melbourne University students or another large university, how many of you share the sentiments that have driven these protests? I don't know what the answer would be, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was well under 50%.
Oh yes, I agree with that. Yes.
So yes, it's encouraging that there are on climate change now, currently on Gaza and a few other issues, that there is this concern, a sense that there are these big challenges. But I'm concerned that the numbers as yet are not at critical mass, number one. And number two, because there is nothing like the large, powerful institutions that were loosely progressive in years gone by, namely political parties, unions, and even religious organizations, at least the progressive end of those, who then had access to large numbers and had muscle of their own. There are no such organizational resources that this small, relatively small cross-section of the younger generation don't have any of those resources to work with. And at times they seem unable, therefore, to connect, to join the dots, to understand how, let's say, climate change or Gaza or mental health or homelessness are interconnected. There is no overall, well, at least that's how it comes across to me. I'd be interested to know what you think. There's no overall understanding of where we're at and how we got to the point where we find ourselves now. There is no such overarching understanding which gives you a sense then of what needs to change. What do you think? Am I being too pessimistic?
No, you're not being too pessimistic. Nonetheless, it is important, I think, to see this small cohort, as you correctly note, is beginning to think. I'm also aware of the thousands of young people who've been out on the streets in Tel Aviv um, for the past couple of months protesting against the Netanyahu government's behavior and genocide in Gaza. And so that encourages me too. I think when the chips are down, we will see an increase in protests. We'll see an increase in violence, I think, in some areas, where particularly when governments try to crack down on the protest movements. And we'll see some terrible conflicts in the future. I'm in other words, I don't think the complacency and the cynicism that characterize our present political crisis and structuring, that's not going to continue unabated. It will be challenged, and we'll see authoritarian governments, and I think all governments are authoritarian around the world at the moment. It's nonsense to say that America, for example, is not an authoritarian country. It certainly is, and increasingly Australia is, and and so is Britain and the European Union countries, and China, of course, is a classic example, and North Korea, and so on. So there will be, I think, we're going to go into a period of great destabilization and conflict. And the thing that I'm hopeful about is that the kind of cynicism and cynicism, moral cynicism that infects the minds of the very people you were talking about earlier, the captains of industry, at the commanding heights of the economy, the cynicism of the intelligence community, and the self-interest of that community, and so on and so on. That cynicism is a form of profound moral laziness, profound moral delinquency. They don't have the tools and the intellect or the intellectual capacity to realize how profoundly immoral they are behaving.
I don't think many of them understand even the proposition you're putting to here. I think they are not so much immoral as amoral. Morality does not occupy a central place in their thinking about themselves or the world and their relationship to it. Morality is not part of the language. Now, getting back to the question of the younger generation, yes, of course, if there is to be any hope, that's where we'll need to find it, to look for it. But I think, unless I'm terribly old-fashioned, it has to, at some point, develop some kind of ongoing organizational muscle and capacity. It can't just rely on spontaneous, sporadic responses to this or that turn in current policy. It's got to be something that's ongoing. And at the end of the day, it can't be just the young people. So a question that's very much on my mind, do you think anything can be done to try and develop some kind of intergenerational space where real conversation about the issues we're dealing with now can take place? In other words, is it within the realm of the feasible that instead of having just the two of us, it might be four or five, where the two or three others might be the kind of younger generation that we're discussing now, just to give it that sense that they're not isolated and that there are still some people who have had experience and so on, where the relationship can then become mutually beneficial.
What an interesting and important question. Um, there is an answer, I suppose, in that the public intellectuals, the people who understand the problems that we're facing as a country, as a region, as a worldwide sort of thing, these people have been largely ignored or downtrodden. We'll probably find most of them, and again, they're only a tiny minority, most of them probably are in universities around the world. I'm thinking of people like, for example, Michael Ignatieff, the Canadian philosopher who's, I think, based in Europe now. Or I think of Charles Taylor, another Canadian, very great philosopher. These people need to talk up a lot more. They lack, I think, our intellectual class, as opposed to our political class, our intellectual class lacks courage. There's a fearfulness that if you speak out or if you don't toe the line, you won't get promotion, you won't get research grants, and so on. And there are many examples of that actually happening, of course. But we've got to find some kind of organizational coherence to bring these people to the forefront and encourage them to talk.
Yes, across generational boundaries, and across all kinds of boundaries. The other thing that concerns me is related to this, and I understand that there are some hopeful signs that by and large, the political system, which is where we started the conversation, still tends to be, in Australia, overwhelmingly Anglo, despite the fact that we've become an increasingly multicultural society. Now, there are some promising signs. Let's say some younger people are able to have a much wider cultural, a wider, higher level of cultural diversity. But still, I don't feel that there is, given the makeup of Australian society now, as opposed to what it was 40 or 50 years ago, I don't think we're taking full advantage of the insights and the different ways of understanding things that are embedded in the many different cultural traditions that currently exist in Australia, indeed in large numbers. Example, we now have around about 1 million or more Australians who are either of Indian background or Chinese background, but somehow they're not really in the conversation a great deal or hardly at all. And I think that's a great shame. And if we could find ways of introducing them, of encouraging them, of welcoming them into some kind of ongoing conversation, I think that too would offer an energy and a different way of thinking that's currently missing out.
I think that's true. But I'm a bit worried about the notion of Australia as the greatest multicultural society in the world, which many politicians love to suggest. I think in a way, multiculturalism has been a flawed idea. Its importance is that it's recognized the value of people being encouraged to hang on to their own identities, their own, and to flourish within them. But the trouble is, I think too many of the very interesting leaders in those communities have turned inward and have cultivated their own communities as little power bases for themselves to negotiate with the current structure. I think it's time to introduce the idea of a cosmopolitan Australia, to develop where instead of multiculturalism saying your cultural identities are wonderful and important and they have a right to exist here in Anglo-Australia, what we've got to say is all of our ethnic identities are fascinating, interesting aspects of the human experience, and it's time we started sharing these.
Absolutely. It's intercultural rather than multicultural.
Absolutely the case. Yes, yes.
So that's another big area that needs to be worked upon to move away, as you were saying, from this sterile idea of multicultural to one that is to one where we create spaces that allow for real exchange and dialogue.
Yes. And again, I've found in the students I've come across at the university very interesting students from Indian and Chinese backgrounds, for example, and other ethnic groups are eager to engage. But in some research my colleagues and I conducted at Melbourne University a couple of years ago, we found that there was a tremendous bifurcation and isolation of communities. The Chinese students spoke to the Chinese students. The Anglos stuck to their own. And the university was content to let this carry on. There was no attempt, no educational process that would enable them to converse and share their experiences and understand the excitement of being involved in such a conversation.
Well, that's another failure of our contemporary universities. Never in our history have there been so many students from different backgrounds, both Australian and also from other countries, and yet so little is done with that precious resource wasted.
There is one other aspect of the future that I think we could briefly talk about. I notice we're beginning to run out of time, but I'm wondering about the wasteland, the economic wasteland that neoliberalism has constructed, and what are the solutions to that? And I'm slightly hopeful that this new future made in Australia idea, where governments actually come back into the economy and encourage and enable and subsidize. In other words, I would argue the ravages of neoliberalism I don't think yet have been fully understood, particularly by economists who are very unable to understand, I think, the nature of not only what's happened, but their very discipline itself, which is, I think, in crisis. But if you could imagine a public set of institutions strategically placed to compete with the people at the commanding heights of the economy. A publicly owned bank, for example, a publicly owned insurance program, the system or organization, a publicly owned housing industry. All of these things, a properly publicly owned health system, which would include specialists and so on, not simply primary care givers. So in all of these areas, we've got to start reimagining, because the crisis of neoliberalism, which has been building for ages, is now crashing around our ears. And I think in particular the massive inequality that we see.
But I think there will need to be, if we're to move in something like the direction you're suggesting, we'd have to move to a point where the public institution, those who are in the business of managing the public sphere are able to bring to it an entirely different philosophy and way of understanding where we're at now and where we might be heading in the future than the one which currently prevails. In other words, it's not enough to put certain resources in the public sphere unless we also put there a philosophy, an understanding of what these resources are meant to do and how they're meant to do it. And then side by side with that, I think the idea of, just as it used to be said, there cannot really be socialism in one country. I doubt that the public sphere can flourish in isolation in one country, where it can't be done in cooperation and solidarity with other public spheres. Because let's face it, there will remain a very strong element of the international structure and framework of current various forms of human activity. So again, we need to cultivate these international connections, these progressive international connections, in a way that was done with some effect in years gone by around different sets of issues. In other words, it's got to be public, but with a certain international consciousness and a certain idea that the next 20 or 30 years have to look very different to the last 30 or 40.
Absolutely. Can I say that, closing, that kinds of things that you've been talking about, the kind of leadership that you've been talking about, I think has been evident in your own work. And I applaud you for that and hope that you'll continue for many, many more years.
We must be careful not to reduce this to a mutual admiration society, because I could say the same things about you. But anyhow, we've got to bring many more people into the conversation.
We do.
And perhaps we can do this again, but with some younger faces as participants in the conversation.
That would be a great idea. And I think there is hope.
There is hope. And we must build on the hope which is there.
That's true. It's been great talking with you, Joe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alan. I've enjoyed it very much.